reminder to our speakers when it's your turn to please unmute yourselves. Boker Tov to one and all. We are very honored to welcome each and every one of you to joining us virtually at the RJC for this morning's presentation, which is a very exciting opportunity for us and a very timely one on the week that we commemorate, memorialize Yom Hashoah and begin our process of celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut in the coming week. I want to thank our education committee. I thank Jeff Kronish and Rivka Falk for all that they do, and Rivka in particular for making this morning's event possible. We hope that as long as the COVID situation remains what it is, we have this special opportunity to learn together on Zoom. And I hope we will continue to use Sunday morning as a slot to learn together. So I want to thank those who are spending their Sunday morning brunch with us. I hope your coffee is hot and fresh and able to enjoy this morning's program together with us. This morning, we are very honored to welcome Menachem Kaiser to the RJC. Menachem's new book, Plunder, which is the topic of our conversation today, is an outstanding new work, which also happens to be the feature of the New York Times Book Review this morning. Menachem, I think that's correct, in the New York Times today, which is pretty fantastic and really an amazing accomplishment for you. Menachem holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan, and he was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, and elsewhere. He's originally from Toronto, and he lives here in Brooklyn, New York. Our conversation will be moderated by a woman who I think needs very little introduction to most of us on the Zoom, and that is our very own Blue Greenberg, and we're so honored that Blue is with us here from Israel. I just wanted to begin before I turn the conversation over to Blue with a few words of introduction. The Torah tells us sometimes, and certainly on Pesach, that we have an obligation to teach our children about the experiences of the past that they did not experience themselves. We have an obligation to teach our children. But there are also times in which the Torah commands us to teach our children and grandchildren as well. For example, at Har Sinai, which we'll celebrate on Shavuos. And the question could be asked very basically, if we have an obligation as parents to teach our children, so why then are grandparents obligated to teach their grandchildren? The obligation is just redundant, at least from a tactical perspective. But perhaps the basic answer to this significant question is that each generation teaches the history of the Jewish people in a slightly different way and with a slightly different voice. And although it is true that parents have an obligation to teach their children, grandparents have an obligation as well to try and teach it from their lens, through their own experiences, through their own language and their own memories. And when we think about the moment that we're living in and the obligation to remember carefully the experiences of the Shoah, we know that we find ourselves in a very sensitive time in which we are still fortunate enough to have survivors among us who can share their own words, their own memories, and their own experiences, along with many who are the children of survivors in that next generation. And now us, if I could say, the grandchildren of survivors who are thinking about what this experience will be. In Blue's introduction to her amazing work, Black Bread, which is poetry about the experience of the Shoah and the experience of being here in America and relating to and connecting with survivors of her own age. In the opening page of her work, she writes, the daily dignity with which they lived their lives, referring to survivors, in the very midst of such evil, and the decency of their second lives is a testimony to all that is good and noble in the human spirit, which is the perfect introduction to what today's conversation is about. Menachem is a real inspiration to those of us in particular who are grandchildren of survivors, not only because he, for those who have read it know, is an incredibly gifted writer, but also because he has not only told the story of his grandfather's experience and his extended family, but he's experienced it walking through the streets and fields and tunnels of Poland to really feel that story and bring it to life in the third generation. And I think for us today, to be able to have a conversation between two different generations that have experienced and thought about the Holocaust and written about the Holocaust in two different ways and in two different voices is exactly what our biblical mandate is. We are lucky enough to have both of them. We are honored to have both of them, and I am excited for this morning's conversation. And for that reason, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our very own Blue Greenberg.
There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Zerkind. And I didn't know until this moment that you're a grandchild of survivors. You can see I've been out of Riverdale for many, many months. I'll like to hear more about that. Thank you for opening the RJC to this, and thank you so much, Rivka, for organizing this, and thank you very, very much to Menachem Kaiser. It's really an honor and a privilege for me. It's an honor and a privilege to be back at the Riverdale Jewish Center, and I'm happy to see so many friends. And secondly, it's really an honor to interview the author on the day that his book appears on the as the lead interview, and the interviews have been the lead book review, I should say. And this is actually an interview and not a book review. And we have about 45 minutes. So I want to begin very briefly with an introduction and my personal reaction to the book, and then set the historical framework of the book, and then ask a few questions so that the audience will be able to hear mostly from our esteemed author. There are well over 1,000, have been for the past few years, well over 1,000 books written on the Shoah, published, I should say, not written, but published on the Shoah. But surely plunder is at the top of the list. The reviews, and there have been so many reviews, are all stunning, all positive. It's hard to say that I loved reading a book about the Shoah, but I was totally spellbound by its autobiographical narrative, the side trails, one family's Shoah history, the honesty and delicious humor, sometimes self-deprecating humor of the author, the stunning insights, and so much more. And Menachem takes pains to do research of historical events which seem tangential to the story, but they are totally relevant, such as the history of the plunder in the regions, in the mountainous regions in which this takes place. The book begins with a simple plot that becomes more and more complicated. Discovery after discovery, Menachem Kaiser is sensitive to the morally complicated issues, and you can see his internal wrestling in every encounter. Plunder, the word plunder has come to mean, in Holocaust terms, the Nazi and Ally plunder of Jewish-owned assets of gold and art and antiques and property, billions and billions of dollars worth, on top of course, the killing and slave labor of 6 million. Most survivors were too worn out, and it was too laborious to take efforts to reclaim individual property, and so many attempts led to dead ends. And aside from German reparations, Poland, which is the scene of the action here, was and is notorious in resistance to assuming guilt and responsibility. And Hungary, Greece, Romania, etc., each has a different and equally terrible record. Sometimes, however, there were survivors who took up the task with the help of their children, the second generation, as did Menachem's grandfather and namesake, who he never met. Mayor Menachem Kaiser was born in 1921 and died in 1977 of heart failure. And his son, Michal Aaron, and his grandson, Menachem, our author, are the key players in this story. Menachem dedicates this book very touchingly just with the words, to Zaidi. He also constructs a family tree. Menachem's father is the only survivor of a large family as he starts out on this story. There are so many threads that are woven in here. Jews in hiding, Jews in slave labor, Jews in transport to camps, Jews disappearing and presumed dead only to resurface with families decades later, Jewish survivors of the killing camps, Jews in the Polish courts, or Menachem and his lawyer, the killer, in the Polish courts, seeking restitution and having to give testimony of the dead. The story of the bounty hunters of Nazi loot, and the ordinary decent Poles that he encounters along the way. The setting for this book is Silesia, which has borders with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. It was taken by Germany during the war and then returned to Poland after the war. It's some 30 miles from Krakow, which is actually where our story begins. So now the questions, and I don't see a picture yet of Menachem, but I'm sure he will as soon as I ask my first question. Please tell us how you started on the journey to Sosnovich.
Sure. Just let me say what an honor to be interviewed by you, Blue, and to be here at the Riverdale Jew Center. And thank you to Rivka Falk for organizing, and Rabbi Zirkin and everyone else responsible. So this began, I spent the academic year 2010 to 2011 on a Fulbright in Lithuania. And I kind of went with no family motivations. I wasn't there to research my roots at all. I ended up researching the Vilna ghetto. My family isn't from Lithuania, everyone's from Poland. And then towards the end of the year, I ended up meeting, like, it's kind of a long and funny story, but I met like a Hasidic Jew in Vilnius, which is unusual, especially in March, who turned out to be the manager for a band that was touring. And his father was the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is sort of improbably still a position. And he invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And I went, and I really didn't go for, again, wasn't going for any family reasons. But once I was there, I felt, I kind of have an obligation to visit my grandfather's hometown. So this was in 2011. I took a trip to Sosnovich. I called my father if he had any addresses. He gave me this one. I couldn't pronounce it at the time, Malachowskiego 12. And I went. I had no reason to think I'd ever go back. It really felt like a one-off, like a sort of an obligation that I fulfilled. I took some pictures. I visited the town hall. I found a handwritten birth announcement. And then, as far as I was concerned, there was really no reason to go back. But over the next few years, my father kept nudging me. He said, we have these papers that belong to my father, so my grandfather, and there's something in there. We own this building. He tried to get it back. No one had really looked at these documents for 20 years. But I had been spending more and more time in Poland, and was building a network, made a lot of friends. And, my father just kept nudging me. And eventually he got tired that I was being lazy, and he just sort of faxed me all the documents to a hotel in Krakow. This was in the summer of 2015. And that's when I sort of opened these documents. And, in the way, I really felt like I met my grandfather for the first time reading those documents. I saw his attempts to reclaim the property from after the war until he died in 77. And I felt very moved. And I felt like, for the first time in my life, a kind of sentimental attachment to him. As at that point, I said, somewhat on a whim, to sort of, I'm in a position that my grandfather never was, to try and do this. And so I contacted the lawyer.
Right. So you described the lawyer in your book as the killer, an 80-year-old woman in a pink velvet pantsuit with black robes on top over it. But what were you actually hoping for? What were your expectations?
Back in 2015, I really didn't have any. This was just it felt like an interesting and potentially meaningful thing to do. And I was spending a lot of time in Poland. I was doing Holocaust-related research, and I was very interested in questions of memory and narrative. And so I thought this was like an interesting way to sort of enter the topic. I had no expectations. It was a process that I didn't know much about at the time. I was not planning to write a book at the time. I was actually really adamant against it when I started. And I said, just let's see what happens. I certainly wasn't out for material enrichment. I just thought, maybe this will be sort of a rich and meaningful experience. And it was like hard to articulate at the time, but I was like feeling my grandfather's presence, and like in a way, but in a way that was very faint. But I was like, this is something that maybe I could explore. The way I put in the book is that allow myself to be disturbed. Um, and
Mhm.
so, yeah, that was like kind of baby steps. And like, looking back, it's hard to say exactly why. You just sort of end up doing something, and you have these very faint reasons that you sort of articulate later.
Mhm. Your lawyer warned you not to go near the house, not, but you went, and it was at the moment when you were hooked on this project, or,
Yeah. Over the next, it took a long time, and I was only in Poland really a month or two a year, generally in the summer, so things moved very slowly. But over the next couple of years, as sort of we were getting the documents together, filing sort of initial claims, I started becoming increasingly uncomfortable about sort of reclaiming a property where people lived without knowing anything about them. So about 2 years after I had filed the initial paperwork, against my lawyer's advice, I sort of knocked on the door, and tried to meet the residents, and successfully did meet the residents.
there's a touching moment there when you say, the person who's standing before you says proudly, without Venum, just says proudly, "And this is my house." And that's where,
Yeah, so I was a coward, and I went in with like a very flimsy pretense. Like I didn't have the chutzpah to come in and really tell them the full story at first. So I sort of made up something about being a researcher, and I didn't let on that I had a family connection to the building. And so I sat, and everyone was just so nice to me and so open. And I met this man in his early 40s named Bartek. And he started telling me his life story, which was kind of incredible, kind of moving, about meeting his mother for the first time in 40 years. Um, and in it, he said, everyone in his family had lived there. So he was raised by his grandparents who lived in the building for decades. And so, yeah, it was sort of my first confrontation with a narrative that wasn't mine.
Mhm. There's a interesting, and on page 187, you end that whole chapter about the search. You said, the house wasn't the house, and the building wasn't the building, and Abraham, whom you'll talk about in a moment, wasn't my grandfather, and my dead relatives aren't dead, and myths are stubborn, and truths unravel, and fictions fit snugly. Was there a point at which you thought you might want to give up this search, having met originally sudden dead ends, or was everything engaging?
Sort of constantly. Someone asked me recently, if I had known sort of the legal troubles going in, would I have done it? And the answer is no. But do I regret anything? No. I think I've just been so lucky and so fortunate to be able to sort of dive into the story and uncover everything I did. From a legal standpoint, probably not worth the thesaurus. But from like a sort of a personal meaning, that's what I got out of it. Yeah, absolutely worth it. But yeah, everything went wrong just constantly. I made mistakes. My lawyer made mistakes. History didn't sort of align with what we thought it was. Typos, and so there was just constant obstacles that we didn't see coming.
I wanted to ask you a question about how you kept your own records, but first I'm going to ask you this, and maybe not pertinent question, but is there any late news about restitution? I know that's still in the courts, or when you wrote the book, it was still in the courts?
Yeah, so actually, like the day I submitted the final draft to the publisher, the courts got back to us and said, sort of, we had cleared the next stage, which was, of course, that was going to happen. And then just last week, I'm sorry, in Chol Pesach, we had another trial, which is sort of one of the last steps. So we are definitely gotten closer, but I've sort of learned from experience that it doesn't really matter how close you think you are. Things don't always behave the way, yeah.
Did you keep notes along the way? How are your descriptions so accurate and present?
So initially, when when I sort of just started the reclamation, I didn't see this as a book, but I did see it as something personally meaningful. So I kept records for myself, not quite the way I would if I were reporting or acting as a journalist, And then sort of when I fell down the rabbit hole of the treasure hunters, that was very compelling. At the time, I thought I would write a novel that included this. So I kept pretty meticulous records and started audio recording pretty much every conversation I had. I was very lucky to also travel with a very talented photographer. And so he was constantly taking photos and I took my own photos. So there was a pretty thick record trail.
I was blown away by the very end of the book where you go back and correct any possible misinterpretations or factual errors in your reportage in the book. That's most authors would not take the time to do that.
I think in a story like this, I think sort of the mistakes are essential.
Mhm.
And that's so if you can't be honest about the mistakes, I think you're missing the point.
So maybe the most important discovery in your book, I mean, this is just from a reader, you have a different interpretation. What I guess the most important discovery for you was rediscovering your grandfather, but in a certain sense, reading this book, the most important discovery was discovering Avraham Kaiser, your father's first cousin. And if you can describe that whole experience and the encounters and your ongoing relationship with that family, from thinking your
Sure.
father was the only survivor to discovering a family.
Yeah, so I sort of, on a whim, ended up contacting a group of, basically I hired a guide to take me for 2 days to introduce me to quote unquote treasure hunters, which were in the news around that time because 2 of them had announced to the world that they discovered a golden train, which is ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that the Nazis had hid inside a mountain. And so I sort of reached out to them again, really for the purpose of, it was just very interesting. I never heard any of this stuff before. I thought maybe I'd incorporate it into a novel. And then once they sort of, we had this really bizarre encounter where they sort of kept saying my last name. I kept overhearing my last name, and then, and they didn't know my last name. So eventually I sort of asked them who they were talking about, and they said Abraham Kaiser, who was a slave laborer who worked on these very mysterious tunnels. And owing to a secret diary he had kept, had become a kind of mythological figure among the community. And so I had all these documents from my reclamation efforts, and I was able to piece together a family tree and discover that Abraham and my grandfather were first cousins, which was just a really startling discovery. My family went from extinct to not extinct. We never knew that anyone in the family survived. My grandfather's siblings, his parents, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins. What we knew was a very large family, but as far as we knew, no one survived. So I found this Abraham Kaiser. He did survive the war, and then afterwards he moved to Israel. He had a wife and a daughter who perished in Auschwitz, but he got remarried, didn't have any kids, but he had a sister who got out before the war and moved to Israel. And he had a brother who ran away in like the late 30s to Argentina. So there were a whole new branch of the family that I got to meet, especially the ones in Israel. So I flew to Israel and I met with Abraham's niece, who's still alive, and the great nephews and great nieces.
And you still have a relationship with them?
Yeah, just during Chol Hamoed Pesach, I was in Florida for Pesach. And me and my father and my brother drove down to Miami to meet Albert, who was another one of Abraham's nephews. I had met him before, but my father had it and my brother had it. So yeah, and then especially the family in Israel, everyone's just been really incredible and warm and open.
What was the response of your father to all of this?
I think there was, at first quite a bit of disbelief. I mean, it took a long time to sort of understand how there was a relative that he didn't know about. So my grandfather died when my father was in his early 20s and really never spoke about the war, but we couldn't really get how this would unknown. And then there was something jogged. I found out that Abraham's brother, a guy named Haskell, ran a crystal company called Kaiser Crystal. And that jogged my father's memory. And we had crystal in the house from Haskell. And then my father remembered meeting Haskell, but there was quite a bit of disbelief that there was this a whole new family that we didn't know about. And it turned into a sort of, I would say, a pride and sort of discovering this new Holocaust legacy that we were able to sort of memorialize properly and recount, and that I was able to write about.
One of the one of your more humorous descriptions is the booty hunter, the treasure hunters, and how they nominated you, the Manhattan and Menachem, or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
Tell about that. That was
So yeah, the treasure hunters, they could be a rowdy bunch. They have a good time during their what they call explorations. So they didn't call me Menachem. They called me first Menachem, which is Munich in Polish, and then my nickname became Manhattan because I was from New York. So yeah, they one of their drinking games was called Nominatia, which was it's not a really drinking game. They just would quote nominate someone for nothing and just everyone would drink. And so I was sort of caught up and struggling to keep up.
I like your description of how you saw the drink was going a little too far and you might not end up alive at the end of the day. And so you managed to dip your, it was
Yeah,
a good lesson in how you can be a drinking fellow and yet not drink.
yeah, I guess I didn't have the tolerance that they do.
So how do you assess that whole group now with hindsight?
My take on them really changed. At first I encountered them and I was like, there's a bunch of silly men with like silly toys. And just to give like a sense of the community, it's a very, very big community. If you include even all the amateurs, it's easily over 100,000 people. And so that includes people who sort of go out with metal detectors on the weekend. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have, professional and sometimes even sponsored expedition groups with very sophisticated equipment. Um, so my first foray, I came out thinking that this was pretty silly, like men with expensive toys getting drunk in the forest. I really didn't take them very seriously. As I got to know them better, saw that was too gross of a characterization. And there are ones who are frivolous, and there are certainly profiteers. But there are also, I would say, pretty serious amateur historians who are absolutely making real contributions. So the example I bring up all the time is one of these treasure hunters who's not looking for stuff, he's not looking for things or treasure. He's devoted to history. And this man has single-handedly discovered 2 concentration camps that had been wiped off the map. And so he had spent years interviewing locals and going to archives. And he took me out to a field outside Świdnica and showed me kind of a brick foundation of what had been the barracks of a concentration camp that is not on the map. And the second thing that I only started realizing pretty slowly over a couple of years is that for all their bravado and their machismo, like they are engaged in maintenance. And like that expedition where we sort of drank at night, during the day, they were cleaning. They were sort of taking the shrubbery, they were removing scaffolding that had been there from a movie set. And these are sites that no one else is taking care of them. These are sites that they're sort of maintaining. And so like, I think their motivations could be complicated, but I think I sort of learned that a motivated love can still be love. And they were sort of guardians and caretakers of these sites. So I do think their sort of contributions should be noted.
I'm not sure if you know that the Riverdale Jewish community was really built by survivors and ex-GIs. Those were the two building blocks of the RJC. And in fact, there still are the children and grandchildren of survivors. And only recently we lost a surviving member of a prominent post-Holocaust family. We also had a family, the Ostry family, that was from Sosnowice. And there are other survivors that we know, a lot of them who built the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Rosenzafts came from Sosnowice and Benzine, and a family from Connecticut, the Struchlitz family, Sigmund Struchlitz and family. So a lot of families from that area contributed greatly to the post-Holocaust Jewish life, including building Jewish life. We also know that survivors are sometimes not happy about others writing about their experience, their very personal experience in their locale and so forth. And I was wondering what has been the reaction to your work from survivors of, these parts. And particularly, I would say, and forgive me if I'm overstepping a boundary here, but you show mercy, some mercy, and a measure of human kindness towards families whose relatives killed your family. And I wonder if there's been any reaction
Hmm.
to that.
Sure. So I will say also that the Ostries were friends of my grandfather.
Really?
So Harry Ostry,
That's right.
Harry
Renee
Ostry,
and Harry. Wow.
yeah. So Harry Ostry, I don't know all the details, but I know I'm pretty sure they were maybe in the camps together, and I don't know that, but there's certainly like a long relationship with my family,
Wow.
and sort of
I hope this is being taped, because if so, we will send the tape to their children, Stephen and Susie Ostry.
yeah, it's being recorded.
Good.
So
I mean, recorded, right?
and then so also I'll mention one of the unexpected blessings of sort of like being like a semi-public about my account of being from Sasnovich is that how many people have sort of been in touch or have over the years have like told them the story and said, wow, I'm from Sasnovich, my grandfather's from Sasnovich, and like meeting landsmen sort of all over the place. And in terms of reactions, it's been, overwhelmingly positive. I think a lot of people are just very grateful to see, to sort of see Sasnovich mentioned and to sort of seeing it being celebrated or being that the fact I went there. And so like the end of the book, in the epilogue, I don't, go into details, but I met a sort of like a mission of mostly American Jews who have roots in Sasnovich and Benjin of like 250 people. And that's a group that I've like come to, I gave a presentation to that group, which on Facebook is like almost 2,500 people. And so it was just like, it's been very gratifying to sort of enter the world where the roots of where I'm from are just taken very seriously and are sort of embraced and celebrated and memorialized properly. And then in terms of pushback, there certainly has been a little bit. I would say it's sort of kind of gone along two tracks. One has been from no survivor has written to me and said like they're disappointed or felt I have been like too soft or too wishy-washy or ambivalent. A couple of second generation survivors have written to me, and they felt a little bit alienated from my account and they felt that they couldn't relate. And I found that to be like a very interesting and instructive response. And then the other criticism has been from some mostly American Poles who, this was kind of more predictable and I take it less seriously. Just a sort of like, you're not talking about Polish suffering. And I was like, this is not, my book isn't about Polish suffering. And sort of, just sort of an extension of like a wider Polish, a lack of reckoning in the Polish narrative.
Great. So I have two more questions, and I'll just and then turn it over because some excellent questions have been raised on the chat. But I just want to tell you that I don't know how I missed this because Judy wrote that Harry Ostry is actually mentioned in your book on page 129, and that Harry Ostry, my father said, my father saved him in the camps.
Yeah, that's my mother. I'm pretty sure. So so my father has mentioned this to me before, and I don't know the details, but it's definitely known in my family.
Right. So there's not much about God in this book. Oops, let's see. We were supposed to disconnect the phone here. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll take one more minute. Okay, good. There's not much about God in this book, although maybe it's an undercurrent, I'm not sure. But it's hard to think about God when you think about the Holocaust, but it's also hard not to think about God when you think about the Holocaust. So, and there was some very poignant scenes there, you standing and reciting Kaddish with your father and other such references that, how strongly connected you are to the tradition, to the Jewish people and the tradition. So what are you can tell me, don't ask me this question, or what are your thoughts about God in this whole experience of yours?
Uh, yeah, I think like addressing the question directly in the book it's like basically paralyzing. And I'm like, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a scholar or even really a historian. And so like I'm a writer and I wrote like my personal experiences and reflections. So yeah, that's what it would be like. I don't know what I would have to contribute. I would say, I don't, this book didn't necessarily change my mind about God, but it definitely deepened my conviction about tradition. And so it just really sort of put into relief like the foundation of where I come from. And it was like I grew up, even though I had Holocaust survivor grandparents, not knowing anything about it and not really being in touch with that legacy. It sort of was like a silent legacy. And this sort of the opportunity to spend all these years in Poland, at first kind of ignorant and naive, and then sort of taking it more and more seriously, and finally culminating in a book, has really allowed sort of like the that sense of tradition and like being able to stretch back and see where I come from to take like a much firmer hold. And so the language of God is one that's tricky for me, but the language of tradition is one that I'm much more familiar with and comfortable with. And that just really sort of, I would say, expanded my vocabulary.
So I'll interrupt before my last question. One of the questions that was on chat, let's see, from Sasha Selma Weingard, to ask you to speak a bit about your background, where you grew up, where we went to school,
Sure.
and what was the focus of your Fulbright study?
So I grew up in Toronto, raised Orthodox, yeah, fairly Orthodox, went to, Orthodox day schools, Orthodox high schools, in Toronto. And then my Fulbright study, well, it's one of those things that you have a focus and then you go and then you get there and see it was completely misplaced. So it was supposed to be about like post-war Yiddish culture in Lithuania. And then I went there and saw that on day one, saw that that would be impossible. And so it ended up being about the Vilna Ghetto.
Interesting. Okay. So your book is about so many different aspects of the Shoah that I said before, and it adds in a way to the incomprehensibility of the Shoah, which is really the only way to appropriate the Shoah, and the enormity of the event in our lives and in our times. Can you say a word about the incomprehensible and what's the larger meaning of all of this and your journey?
Yeah, one of the things I really strive to do in like trying to say what I felt like was an honest accounting of my story was sort of knowing my place. And so there's I am not my grandfather, and I'm not my father. And I sort of like when I read accounts that sometimes sort of blur those lines, I have a really hard time relating. And so sort of like making those boundaries clear was very important to me. It's the only way that I felt I could write an honest book, is this like, I am not my grandfather and I cannot relate to him. I only have my experiences and what's been passed down to me. And I sort of like will not force myself to grapple with questions that will sort of overwhelm me and paralyze me. And I really strive to sort of like mark that separation. And so, yeah, I'm sort of answering your question obliquely, but sort of, I wanted to note that incomprehensibility, but also more than that, the inaccessibility. And sort of like, I'm someone who this was passed down to, and I could like struggle with what I face, but I almost don't even dare asking questions of like how the survivor could relate or feel, because those are just, were never posed to me, and I couldn't do them justice in any way. Like my contributions, I think, would be meaningless.
Maybe that's why your book is so very accessible to everyone, including readers who have no knowledge of the Holocaust and reviewers, who come at it with fresh eyes. I'll ask, I see where there's one question which sort of continues what you just said. It says, from Elizabeth Liss. Please ask Menachem why he ended the book with a an anecdote that is a divergence from the main story, the Steve anecdote.
Yeah, it is. It is a divergence. For those who haven't read the book, that there's an epilogue about a man I met from the Midwest who has a kind of remarkable story about his father-in-law hiding 10 golden eggs, and he has a map of where they are in a sort of an attic in Beijing, and sort of we go together to search for the eggs. Yeah, I don't have a satisfying answer for this, but it felt right to me. It felt like a thematic close of sort of like literal treasure being searched for, and sort of what that hunt means. And the fact that it wasn't my story and that I was able to borrow from it kind of was able to make it even purer. It sort of distilled the essence of it. And like, I didn't have to sort of struggle with the meaning of it. It wasn't my story, but I was able to borrow. So it certainly didn't fit in the body of the book, but it felt like thematically that it brought a lot of the strands together at the end. And I'm a fan of sort of a harsh juxtaposition. I think like if the reader's sort of asking why, to me, that's an interesting question. No one should feel alienated. If, Elizabeth, if she felt that it was improper, I'd be very curious and open to hearing why. But I like that. I like that sort of charge and sort of like leaving that question open and sort of a harsh cut.
So I guess this comes at it from a different angle, or maybe you've answered this already from Suzanne Wimpheimer, is how can one have a positive reaction just standing in that place? The Poles are really not sorry. You sort of addressed that before. I don't know if you want to.
I don't really speak for anyone, and I'm not a representative, and I'm certainly not out to like apologize for other behaviors. All I can speak is my own experience. And so like, I spent a lot of time in Poland, mostly in the big cities in Krakow and in Warsaw, sometimes pursuing this project, sometimes pursuing other projects. But generally speaking, the sort of attitude that I encountered was one of support and one of curiosity and even like help. And so, I certainly would encounter, I would say, sometimes puzzlement and sometimes things that verged on unintentional, I would just, let's say, ignorance, but I almost never encountered out and out hostility. And so I do not sort of make statements about Poles in general. I make statements about what I encountered. And so, but I respect everyone else's experiences.
No, I think you just struck a remarkable balance, and from the strength of your own character and personality. Rivka, we'll give Rivka the last question. When you were growing up in a large, close-knit family, did you feel the void of knowing about your grandfather's life before and during the Shoah? And did resurrecting Abraham Kaiser give you a feeling of tikkun for the Kaiser family?
That's a good question. I definitely felt the void because I knew nothing about my grandfather's experience in the war, but it didn't particularly bother me, to be honest. It wasn't something that I felt was lacking. It just was sort of like a very strong default. And that's, my father says often, and sort of like to emphasize just how normal it was, that he grew up not knowing anyone who had grandparents. Like the very concept of grandparents was exotic. So like it wasn't weird to me. Most of my friends had survivor grandparents. And it's, it's probably speaks to like my lack of imagination, curiosity, but it just like felt like a normal thing. And so there was definitely a void, but I was for most of my life untroubled by it. And then did resurrecting Abraham give you a feeling of tikkun? I don't know. I know. I think it sort of, it put into relief my ignorance and sort of made me pine the fact that I was able to learn so much and such an incredible story about this man who was not my grandfather. And so tikkun, I wouldn't say tikkun, but it felt like a real, like a privilege to be able to access such a story and to be able to tell it. And maybe in a somewhat qualified sense, it felt like I was able to, like we had a sort of an amazing Holocaust legacy that I was able to tell. That felt special, but tikkun is a strong word, so I don't quite know.
Good. You're so honest, and also you have such an ability to nuance things. It's really such a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you.
My pleasure.
And thank you very, very much. Are you working on a new book now?
So I wrote a novel in grad school about Yiddish poets. And so, your work on poetry, I've read it and very much appreciate it. And so it's a pretty much finished novel. And so hoping to return to that sometime soon.
Good. Well, kol hakavod to you, Yasher Koach, and thank you so much for this time and your presence and your work, and much success going forward.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Bro. It's a real honor.
I want to take this opportunity to jump in and just for a second to pause and thank Blue Greenberg for this wonderful interview. I think it is a reflection of her wisdom and also her grace in handling this topic. And we are so fortunate that you were able to join us and lead Menachem and all of us through this conversation. Menachem, if you'll allow me, with the time that we have remaining, I'd like to ask two concluding questions that I hope will give us food for thought as we conclude this program. The first is that we share that grandchild of survivors piece of who we are. And I'm curious, after having gone through this journey, both physically, personally, but also as a writer, what would your message be to the other grandchildren of survivors out there? What do you think they can learn from your experience and from your efforts?
I think, I think maybe the takeaway is your story, however familiar it is within your family, is very much worth exploring. The way people often ask me, like, should they go to their hometown, like their ancestral hometown, should they make that trip, that pilgrimage? And I'm like, look, I don't know if you're going to find anything. I don't know, who knows? But I can guarantee you'll have a really meaningful and strange time. And so it's really very much Kedai to sort of explore this, because like I guarantee it's not as exactly what you think it is, and like certain facts will emerge and certain sentiments will be uncovered that you'll never be able to predict, and it's just like an incredibly enriching experience.
Okay, fantastic. And for a final question for today, personally, and also I think it'll give us some opportunity for thought for ourselves. Could you try and in some way, shape, or form, describe the difference for you personally in what Yom HaShoah used to mean before this project and what observing Yom HaShoah means to you now and going forward?
That's an interesting question. I grew up with Yom HaShoah sort of just being a day on the calendar where I would watch movies and sort of see photographs and sort of like feel the sense of like communal responsibility to feel sad. Like that was sort of like the message that I received growing up. And, I think it's important, but I think it was like a kind of an unnuanced approach. And I think sort of having this incredible opportunity to spend all these years researching and writing and presenting, and now speaking about the experience, to me, it's like very, very special that it's commemorated on the calendar. I don't think growing up I appreciated what that means, to like have a designated time to do something, but like within even traditional Judaism, that idea of once something gets on the calendar, it sort of gets codified, and sort of like to have a special place, and also to make it even more personal. I don't know if I had in the past had made it sort of about my family. I sort of like felt this sort of general sadness or like a kind of collective mourning, which is important. But now, having written this book, being able to sort of probe deeper and commemorate even more specifically. I'll also mention just two quick things that just on Thursday night, Friday was actually my grandfather's yahrzeit. So Mayor Menachem Kaiser, who died in 1977, and was, he passed on Chav Zayin Nisan. So it's actually like an even more auspicious time. A more special time. And also, let me just mention before I close out that I'm seeing some other comments and questions that I have an email that if anyone would like to reach out with sort of general comments or questions, or if they want resources, or if they want to be pointed in directions for their own genealogy research, I'm very happy to help or to be in conversation with you.
I just want to thank you again for spending the time with us. Really an amazing accomplishment. what plunder is and is for the experience of learning about the Holocaust, but also I think quite the high bar and the challenge for all of us who have more to learn and more to commemorate from our own personal stories. And I hope that we can take from that to make sure that Yom HaShoah continues in the next generation to be a personal experience and not just any other date on the calendar and that sense of obligation that comes with it. So again, thank you to Blue, thank you to Menachem, congratulations to you on this really tremendous milestone. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. We will turn off the recording at this time as our program concludes, but we are a few minutes early. So Menachem